Welcome back to First Python Notebook. This is Ben Welsh, broadcasting live from Manhattan, USA. We're ready for our next chapter, and this one covers how to group and aggregate your data. That might not sound very exciting, but it's incredibly important in any data analysis, and it helps you answer some very important questions. Questions like, which helicopter company had the most accidents? Questions like, which state had the most accidents? Questions like, which helicopter company had the most fatalities? These are three questions we'll be able to answer just in the next few minutes by learning this very simple trick, which allows you to take any character field, like states or helicopter makers, to group the data so that the common values are put together, and then to compute new statistics that summarize what's inside each of those groups. If you were in a program like Microsoft Excel, this is where you would use something called a pivot table. You may have heard that term before, and it's just a different way of talking about the exact same operation. And learning how to group and count, or group and sum, or group and average your data is one of the real fundamental skills of being a data journalist. And Pandas makes it very easy, and it allows you to do it over very, very large data sets with no problem. And so we're going to cover that here now in this chapter. So we're going to go back to our notebook where we left off. Remember, if you've reset your computer or opened and closed your notebook, you may need to run all the cells again from the top to bring them back to life. You can do that in the Run menu by selecting the Run All Cells option, which I've just done. And from the top, everything has run all the way down to the bottom again. We can see our most recent work was the stuff I was doing with the filter. Since we ended up not integrating that into our analysis, I'm going to take those cells and I'm going to clip them out with the X key. You can feel free to leave them. It's up to you. And so now we're going to try to, again, ask and answer a question. And at the heart of the story, really, is the question of which helicopter model has the most fatal accidents over this period of time. And we'll get to this in the next chapter. We're ultimately going to want to calculate a rate that allows us to adjust that based on how popular the helicopters are. Obviously, the more time you're in the air, the more accidents you may have, right? And so we're going to ultimately need to get there. But before we can calculate that rate, we need to finalize our finding about which helicopter make and model had the most fatal accidents. And then we need to prepare and prep that data so that it's ready to be used to calculate a rate, which will require that we ultimately have a nice and tidy data frame at the end of the day. And we're going to do that using the group by method. And so if we hit our variable accident list, which if we just run head real quick and have a fresh look at, we'll remember is one row per fatal accident, right? We can look at the first five, and there's this LA times make and model column where we corrected a little problem and we think it's ready to go. I'm going to copy the name of that so I don't have to type it. And I'm going to replace head with our new friend, our new function group by. And it's not group underscore by, it's group by one word. You might ask why. I don't know. The truth is that the creators of Pandas over the years were just a little inconsistent about how they named things. And this is a good example of where if you were a strict English teacher and you compared it to something like value counts, which we learned earlier, had an underscore, you might say this should probably have an underscore too. But whoever wrote the code decided not to, and whoever was overseeing the code at the time decided to overlook that. And so we have a little bit of inconsistency and a little bit of sloppiness in Pandas, which is a common problem in open source software. It doesn't really cause any issues with the analysis itself. You definitely don't need to disclose it to the readers of your story, but it's the kind of thing that may drive you a little crazy when you're beginning, and it's just something you kind of have to learn as you go along. And so in our case, we want to group by the LA times make and model column, pardon me. Oops. And so I am just going to type in LA times make and model as a string value and pass that into the group by method. If I do that and run my cell, I get nothing back. It's grouped the data, but it hasn't done anything with it. So all the Robinson records have been put together, all the Bell 206 records have been put together, but we haven't instructed the computer yet what to do with those groups. And so what we get back is a little cryptic and not all that helpful. But what we wanted to Dell to do, and this is part of the process of translating our question from English into Python, is we want to tell it or ask it to calculate the count of fatal accidents per group. And the way you do that in pandas is you put dot size, open source or open parenthesis, close parenthesis after the group by and hit play. And now what it's done, and this is very similar to the group by method we learned earlier, what it's done is just counted up the number of fatal accidents for each helicopter. Now, big deal, you could have done this with the shorter line of value counts code. I get it. This on its own is not all that impressive and is actually more verbose than the trick we already learned. However, the group by method gives you a lot more that you can do than just count things, right? And this is why it's worth it once you have more interesting and complicated questions. So for instance, a question I raised earlier is, okay, this is how many accidents each helicopter model had. But what about fatalities? We know that some accidents have more fatalities than others, right? So while I think we're ready to be able to claim the Robinson R-44 had the most fatal accidents, did it actually have the most fatalities, the number of people who died? This is an interesting thing for us to know so that we don't say the wrong thing when we write our story and that we're fully accurate and that we're fully fair to our subject. And so to do that, we have to look back at that total fatalities column we asked earlier. And so what I want to do in that group by is I want to say for each of these groups, I don't want you to count the records. I want you to sum the total fatalities for each group. And that's very easy to do in something like pandas, kind of shockingly easy. So you start by taking your group by the exact same starting point. So this, we have the data grouped, but we haven't said what to do. Now we can index from the group that same column. So remember how we were earlier indexing off columns from the whole data frame and it would just print the full column? And we could try to analyze it that way. Pandas also lets us index the group. And so then for each group, the total fatalities will be pulled out. If I hit play there, we still get an error. And it says what? Oh, column not found. Ben, you have a typo. Fatalities. Fatalities. Hit play. So that's a good example of the Python error message letting me know I made a typo. So, okay, so now it's still saying it's still just a group by, Ben. You've got a series group by. And what do you want me to do with total fatalities? You know, what for each group, do you want me to count or whatever? And what we want to do is we want to sum. So remember, in the same way, we could call on a numbers column and have it sum the number for the entire data frame earlier on. You could also have it sum a column for each and every group in your data frame, which allows you to create a ranking. And so this is just taking this same trick, which we learned earlier, right? And so for instance, I could just write down here at the bottom, paste that in. Oh, sorry, paste in that same code minus the group by, right? So here we have the group by, we index the column and we sum it. That gives us the total fatalities for the entire database, right? Above it, we have the exact same code, except we've slipped in there the group by. So before it does the summing, it groups the data, and now we're summing by group. And so just with that little modification in the chain of code, we ask the data a different question. And so now we see, looking at this data set, that the Robinson R-44, with its 38 fatal accidents, had 71 total fatalities. Well, there's a higher number right there. So the Airbus 350, which only had 29 accidents, that's 9 fewer accidents than the Robinson, actually ended up with 81 total fatalities, a significantly higher number. So that suggests maybe it's a bigger helicopter, maybe the types of accidents were, somehow more, of greater significance. I don't know, right? But there's clearly some difference there. And if you were thinking about what you were considering sending to your editor as a claim that we might put in the story, is you wouldn't want to say that more people died in Robinson helicopters, because that's not backed up by the data, is it? What you can say is they've had the most accidents, right? Not the most fatalities. And so like a very subtle difference in what you're going to write and what it would be fair and truthful to report, can be sorted out, right here in your code, right? And this is something that you can document and keep and share with others and refer back to when you're writing your story to make sure you don't get it wrong. Now, another issue with what we're seeing here is the results are these kind of difficult to read computer printouts that don't look as nice and tidy as our data frames, right? With their nice formatting. And so one handy trick that it's important to learn, especially when you want to reuse the results of a group by later on, is to convert the result of the group by into a data frame. So we're not going to use the total fatalities data, so I'm going to cut that out. But the way you do that in pandas is, again, one of these strange quirks of the library, which is after you've run a group by function and done your aggregation, if you tack on this odd function called reset index, it will convert the result of your group by into a tidy data frame of data. And so now we see here that we have one row per result. The makes and models are all lined up, and the result of our aggregation is a tidy column. A data frame like this is going to be really useful to us in the next chapter when we learn to merge in other data, because we're going to want to be able to compare this accident count with some denominator, right, so that we can calculate a rate. But before we do that, there's one like ugly thing here we see in our result is after we did the reset index, the result of our analysis is stored in a column named 0. Not very helpful, right? This is just another one of the like odd things about pandas, is that when you do a size operation followed by reset index, it doesn't know what to name the column. And so you have to give it a name. Now, there's multiple ways to do this, and they're all good, but one that I just have gotten used to is anytime I call .size, I follow it by calling .rename, and then in quotes, I give it the name that I would like to have for the column. And so in this case, I'm just going to call it accidents, because this is our count of fatal accidents. And so you can see, and the code is getting a little long and hard to read, you can see that we've done our group by, our size, our rename, and our reset index, ... We've chained all that Python together, and the result is a nice and tidy data frame that's ready to be merged with another data set, ready to be output and shared with people on our team, and is getting close to something that we might call a finding. And so, we're going to reuse this in the next chapter as we merge in our denominator to try to calculate a rate. And before we do that, we're going to want to save this as a new variable. So I'm going to click on the far left, and I'm going to say not accounts, accident counts is what I'm going to call it, equals that whole big long line of Python code, right? And so now if I run that, I can in my next cell type in accident counts, run the code, and boom, there's our complete list, our sort of first finished result, which is the total number of fatal accidents for each make and model. This is now a ranking we can work with, and we're ready to merge in another data set and try to really come up with a stronger finding.